Okay, so now we're getting into our second pass of blocking. This is where we define our tweens, those poses that help us define the transition between our main story poses. So there are a couple of ways of generating a tween. The first, I guess, simplest one is just to duplicate an existing pose and use that to tweak. So I can just make this down extreme on the run, for example, and just make the foot come up, come forward, make the hand come down, and so on. Just start tweaking from there. The other approach is to actually generate an in-between, just a linear in-between, using the tween tool. So by selecting all these and pressing Shift E, you can see the body is more or less just moving in a linear fashion between the two. Now just ignore those arms for a moment, I'll cover that in a moment. But yeah, those are the two general approaches. I'm either going to duplicate an existing pose or generate a transition pose that I'll use then to tweak. Now, what is happening with those hands? Well, basically what's happening is we're transitioning between using IK and FK. Actually, we're transitioning from FK to IK there. So what's actually happening in between there is, I'll just go to the 50% point. The IK hands are actually moving from their default point up until the next pose, and at the same time these IK sliders are moving from 0 up to 1, so they're at 50% at this point. So how do we get around this and still make use of the in-betweening tool? Well, really the trick is to make sure the IK hands have a good starting point, and they're starting out at this point, and make sure the FK hands have a good ending point, and they're ending at that point. So what we do here is just select these two hands and snap the IK to the FK, set a key on the whole character, and then do the reverse at the other side. Snap the FK to the IK, and once again set a key on the whole character. Now I can grab all these controllers and generate my in-between. So those are the two methods I'll be using: duplicating poses and generating poses. Now, one little note about that in-betweener: it has what I consider to be a bug. Now, if you remember, I was trying to make this character do a clockwise rotation. Well, firstly I'll set up my my IK endpoint here. So snap the IK to the FK on both, and set a key on the whole character. And if I generate an in-between, you can see what happens. The character is actually rotating anti-clockwise, the opposite direction to what I intended. So there is actually an alternate method. Instead of using the in-betweener, what we can do is actually set all these keyframes to be linear. And suddenly you can see the character is moving the way I intended it. Now all I need to do is set a keyframe on all channels, and I can switch back to constant, and I've got a nice in-between that I can start tweaking. So those are the methods I'll be using, and the things I'm looking out for as I'm producing these in-betweens are the arc of motion, which I'll just demonstrate now. Now if I put a dot here where the hips are, and a dot here on this pose, now if I left it up to the computer and used those auto in-betweens, all I would get would be a straight line, and it'd look very boring indeed. In fact, I'll show you. Let's get him right in the middle, and yeah, there we go. He's traveling on a straight line. Doesn't look at all physically realistic. So how do we get around that? Well, we have to think about what's happening going into this pose. Basically, he's going to have run along this roof, so he's going to have a lot of forward momentum, and so he's going to proceed forward before gravity takes hold and brings him down. So the arc is actually going to look more like this, something along those lines, or maybe even up a bit. But it's going to be that sort of thing, rather than a linear sort of transition. We're actually going to get an arc. So I have to bear that in mind as I make my in-between pose. The other thing I have to think about is the transition of the body shape. So let's bring up a new layer and I can illustrate this. So at the moment, even though all the body parts are doing something different, there is a clear line of action. So if I was to draw that, it would be something along this sort of line. So he's leaning forward, he's got forward momentum, that's the general line of action. For this point, he's actually gone into a bit of a C, like a reverse letter C. And that's more of a going into a squash pose. So the question is then, how do we transition between the two and make it look physically viable, physically plausible, and visually interesting? Well, firstly, I want to think about this squash pose. Normally, as you would know from the bouncing ball, a squash pose is preceded by a stretch pose. So I'm thinking as he comes in, I want him to actually be leaning back and making that sort of a straight line, so that as he goes in, he can recoil. And that would mean somewhere about here, we'd have a pose that goes something like that. So it's a bit of a transition from this, where this leg comes forward, it's going to swing around into this pose. So those are the sorts of concepts I have to think about: line of action and the transition of body shapes. And so as I move through and start making these, I'm going to have to keep an eye on this sort of thing. So let's get in and start making some tweens. So several things to think about as I do this pass. This is when I'm really getting into the animation. This is the pass that I can spend the longest on, actually, because not only am I introducing the in-betweens, but as I do this, I'm starting to really think about overlapping action. So particularly in this case with his arms, but also the shape of the body, just basically thinking about having the body landing and then compacting, for example, and stuff like that, just having actions happening, hitting on different keyframes. So overlapping motion is very important at this stage. And also you'll notice I'm really getting into finer detail with the poses themselves. So I'm actually tweaking original story poses as well. And this is based on my experiments with introducing the tweens and the sort of overlapping motion I want. But it's also just because this is the higher detail pass. This is where the poses have to start really working, because I'm duplicating them and using them as the basis for automatic tweens. And so if the main poses aren't working, then there's no point in doing that. So yeah, really polishing all the poses and trying to make it work. And as you can see, always keeping an eye on the bigger picture. Those grease pencil sketches, I can really recommend them. It's easy just to be caught in the viewport and start just making tweens and ending up with very linear motion. But if you just, with the grease pencil, it's easy just to quickly try a few ideas, see what works, and then base your actual posing on that. Save yourself a lot of time doing that. As you can see, he's actually, this time around, he's leading with his upper body, as opposed to the previous two jumps where the feet have landed first. And I've also actually introduced a little bit of asymmetry in how the feet land, so that actually the right foot is going to be landing slightly before the left. These are all just things to break it up. Human bodies very rarely move in a completely symmetrical way. And so you can just make things look a bit more natural, even though these are fairly symmetrical poses. Just break up when things land, when things kick off, and just change the symmetry around a little bit. So here he's going to a bit of a compress before jumping downwards. So once again, I'm trying to keep this from getting too linear, and I've drawn in a little arc there just to make it clear to myself that I want to follow an arc. He's going to kick out away from that fire escape, and so it's important that he goes backwards a little bit before actually dropping, and to also show that in the pose with a bit of an extended leg. So then the legs come down. Once again, a bit of asymmetry. This time around, the left foot is going to land slightly before, and yeah, I've got the arms up. I'll probably revise that a little bit, because once again, I don't want to completely twin what happens. But yeah, a lot of backwards and forwards. You find yourself going forwards doing a few tweens and then find an idea, and then that makes you have to go back and adjust the previous poses. But that's fine because we're only dealing with a few poses at this stage. This is exactly the time to be doing those sorts of experiments. So for example, I'm tweaking the feet here, but pay attention to what the arms are doing. They're actually coming forward, which seems like a perfectly reasonable thing, like a bit of a superhero pose. But as I went forward, I actually found that wasn't going to work for me. So there I am, sketching the arc, trying out a few different ideas, and it looked okay, but I needed to change a couple of things I found. Firstly, we didn't have a very good overlap with the arms. As he comes down and hits the canvas, that wasn't quite working. Secondly, as he was bouncing off the canvas, it really didn't have the effect of the trampoline that I was after. So there I am, I'm going in and adjusting those arms, and this is to introduce some overlap into the arms. So before his arms come forward, they're going to be back a bit, and this will just show a bit of a, like his arms slap down a little bit as a result of hitting that canvas. And as he comes up, I also made him jump a little bit higher. So you can see he's now above that original sketch that I'd done. And this all just adds to the dynamic. You really want to be pushing poses at this stage and really trying to make it as dynamic as possible. As we get into this section where he comes around the pole, it's a good place to demonstrate my preferences for FK versus IK. Now, as I've said before, I tend to favour IK feet and FK arms, and that's because most of the time the feet are either in contact with the ground or about to be. But in this case the legs are swinging freely, and I really want to have a nice arc to the feet as they come around. So this is a good time to use FK for the legs, and I can really demonstrate why by switching these keyframes all over to Bezier. And I'll just show you what happens to the feet. Make some motion paths. You can see what happens. I've just got a straight line, and what happens in between is that the legs get really crunched up. It's not at all what I want. I really want the feet to be swinging widely. Now you might think the way to deal with this is to introduce a new in-between, and that does work. I'm getting a bit more of an arc, but it seems to be an inefficient way to go. Why introduce a new in-between if I don't need to? Basically, it just means another pose I have to polish. So just re-update that path. So what I'm going to do is switch over to FK, and this is for the same reason I generally favour FK in arms, because I can get some arcs for free without having to do all this extra animation. So if I go back to this pose, this is where I'm going to switch into FK. I'll actually go to the pose before, and I'm going to snap the FK controllers to the IK. This is for the same reason as I demonstrated before. I want to have a good starting point for the FK pose. So I'll set a key on the whole character. Now we get into the bit where we're really going to start using FK. So I'm going to snap, and then I'm going to dial down to FK. Once again, set a whole key, because these snap things don't set keys automatically. It's actually a good thing, by the way, but you just have to remember to set a key. So here we go. Only a few poses. And lastly, but this is going to be IK by now. I'm just setting the destination point. So let's see what happens now if well, you can already see it in the body pose, but if I demonstrate with motion paths on these FK feet, let's make sure I have them selected. Here we go. You can see straight away I'm getting a really nice arc, and I don't have to introduce a new in-between. So that means for this whole section where he swings around the pole, I've got 1, 2, 3. 3 poses that I have to polish rather than 6. So it cuts down on work, and it gives you a lot of nice smooth motion for free. So I'm going to get in and start polishing these poses. Well, first I have to switch back to constant. But yeah, knowing that I'm using the FK feet here, means that I can quite easily just adjust these poses and know that they will tween quite nicely. So let's get back into it. So having made that decision to use FK feet and thus limiting the number of tweens I have to put in there, means I can now really get in and just polish those key poses that I put in before, even down to the level of getting the fingers wrapped around that pole. Now I am actually anticipating to have to adjust particularly the hand animation because of that IK interpolation issue I just demonstrated. I'm expecting the hands aren't exactly going to cling to the pole no matter how well I get these key poses. So yeah, in the splining and polish pass I'll have to deal with that and make sure that they really look like they're grabbing onto that pole. I'm also dealing with the overall arc of the body. As he comes around, he's going to start out with his legs backwards, but around the top of the pole his legs are starting to come forward until at this point where he's up in the air, his body is pretty much defining the arc of motion. So it really makes it clear to the audience, you know, where the momentum is headed, and it really sells the fact that he's swinging around to come landing onto the ground. Now as he does land onto the ground, this is when I have to get really particular about what the feet are doing in particular, but also that hand as it comes down. Because now, you know, I was a bit rough before, but now's the time to really define these contact points. So I've got the right foot and the hand they're pretty much going to stay where they land, just compact a little bit. But the left foot is actually going to do a bit of a slide. It's going to hit the ground at one point and then slide backwards. And I've got that from the reference footage. As you can see, I'm always keeping an eye on the reference footage as I get into this section. And yeah, I'm also trying to work in a bit of overlap so that as he comes down, he's a little bit extended and then squashes down. So I'm overlapping with some squash and stretch, as well as just a bit of, you know, just subtle movement as he bounces back again. That's sort of a bit of overshoot, and then he comes back up into position. So even working in some subtle stuff at this stage. So as he looks at his hand, just a slight move in the body. I want the body to start moving before the hand, and then the hand comes up and he looks at it. But yeah, this is a good time to review what I've done so far, I think. Okay, so you can see we've progressed a fair bit since the first pass of blocking. Whereas we used to have a series of just story frames, now we've actually got some animation. The character looks like he's actually got some weight, and that he's got a brain and he's observing the world and reacting to it. And so yeah, we're about 2/3 of the way through the second pass of blocking. I still have a few tweens to add. I've still got some polishing to do on these poses, but yeah, you can see that it's taking shape. The reason I'm reviewing now is because this would actually be a good time to show the animation to someone else and get some outside advice. So either just ask a friend or put it on the forums. If you're working on your own shot, this would be a great time to get some advice. Basically, you want to find out if people with fresh eyes can actually understand what's going on in the shot, firstly, and secondly, if there's something physically going on that looks a bit strange that you might not have picked up on because you've been focusing on something else. So yeah, it really helps a lot to get the advice from other people. And this would be a good time to do it before proceeding into polish. Because basically, if someone doesn't understand what's going on in the shot at this stage, you really need to go back and review what you're doing. But for now, I'm just going to watch this video over and over again, make a few notes, and then finish off the second pass of blocking. I'm starting out with the run cycle. So I'm defining some poses before he even comes into the camera view, which you might think is a bit of a waste of time, but actually, because he's coming into view at full speed, like in the middle of a run, I really want to work out all the arcs of motion in particular, but just what's happening with the body. Really leave the audience in no doubt that he's run across that roof before we see him. So now I'm adding a few in-betweens to really get the jump across the alley looking good. Now, one thing I'm paying attention to is the arc of motion of the extremities. Now, before I was just looking at the overall arc of motion of the body, but now I'm really paying attention to the extremities, and by that I mean the head and the two hands and feet. And you've noticed I've actually coloured them differently in the Clive rig, and this is so that you can really pay attention to this in your blocking pass. And it's at this pass of the blocking that I'm really paying attention to, making sure particularly the feet, which are IK for most of this shot, really they have to move in nice smooth arcs, otherwise it sort of starts looking unnatural. And I certainly don't want hands popping around all over the place as well. They have to move in a nice arc, otherwise the audience can't really make out what's going on. So yeah, I'm working through this, making sure that the launch off from the fire escape works into that twist around. It's actually a bit of a complicated maneuver, so I had to define quite a few in-betweens. You can see now I'm actually almost every second frame has a pose now. Now, not everyone favours this approach. Some animators would have actually already gone into splining by now, but this is just how I like to work. So I end up with a fairly complicated blocking pass, but it's good by the time you switch on the splines to have a lot of things worked out, and so that you can almost just do a small, like very fast polish pass by the time you go into Bezier splines, because you've already worked out most of your action. And actually in stop motion animation and also in 2D, they quite often work in what's called twos. So pretty much only having a change of pose every second frame as a way of, being efficient. So that's almost the stage I get to by the end of my blocking. But yeah, we're just about there. I think we'll just have a quick review of how it looks, and then we can proceed into this spline and polish pass. So I've rendered out a preview with the high-res model, so let's have a quick review of the blocking pass. So you can see it's really a lot more detailed now, and I've figured out a lot of the issues to do with momentum and weight, and all of the extremities have nice arcs of motion so you can really follow what they're doing. And it actually almost has a stop motion feel to it, because of, as I said, in stop motion they tend to animate on twos, so it already has that sort of feeling to it. But now we're ready to proceed out of the blocking pass and turn on the splines and start polishing this up and finishing it. So that's the end of second pass blocking.